I invite us to stand as we hear the gospel today, which is according to St. Luke, the 20th chapter. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection. By the way, I have to teach you the joke just in case you don't know the joke. If you ever want to remember the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, it's the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, so they're sad, you see. Okay. Now that I've taught you that joke that I've heard 40 times in my life, okay. The Sadducees came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher. Oh, I should add, by the way, this is totally not related to the sermon or anything, but most religious of this time period didn't believe in the resurrection or life after death. That was new with the Pharisees. So the Sadducees were also the normal people. Okay, so that's of note. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married a woman and died childless. Then the second and the third married her, and so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. May be seated. I'm talking on a topic today, but I want to say one thing about this text because I think it's maybe helpful and interesting, and you can reflect on it later also if you don't forget that I said this because of what I say after it, but who knows. The logic of the New Testament about the resurrection is not based on the idea, which is the most common idea in our culture. I just read this week that 80% of Americans believe that they will live on after they die, regardless of their religion. That's almost always based on the idea that we think we have a soul that's eternal, that's apart from the body and inhabits the body for a while and is going to continue to live after we die. That's the basic idea. You can believe that if you want, but it's not the biblical idea. The biblical idea is, and this is very interesting, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the ancestors all had a God, and that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And since in the Bible it says that God is, present tense, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, therefore, since that God is a living God, all those for whom that God is the living God also live in that God. So the resurrection is based on the idea that God is a living God. And if God is your God, then somehow your life will be maintained in God, even though you die. So have fun with that today. All right, now on to what I decided on as a topic for today, because I've been doing this fall series. I gave it the title Sobriety and Inclusion. So the first thing to know is I'm an addict. I talk about this sometimes, although not all of the time. I've only really have the one addiction that was disruptive in my life, which is alcohol. And I was really good at drinking alcohol. I drank a lot of it. And I learned to drink when I was living abroad especially. I was one of those weird kids who was kind of legalistic, so I didn't start drinking until I was 21. I actually didn't drink any alcohol until I was 21, except for maybe like tastes of beer, like if it was around the house and my parents were having it with friends or something. But I drank a lot of stuff on my birthday for when I turned 21, but it was a bad idea. I drank a bunch of wine coolers and then puked. I didn't know how to drink, right? So anyway, I learned how to drink. I got really good at drinking, and I lived in Slovakia in Eastern Europe. There's a really strong drinking culture in Eastern Europe in general. The first day that I was teaching at the Lutheran school I was teaching at, I was served 2 shots as a welcome. Only 2. But I don't blame that situation. I think I have an addictive brain. The way my brain responds to alcohol is different than other people's. I know lots of people who can have a drink, and it tastes good, and they can drink it slow, and then be done. My brain, if it is introduced to alcohol, says, where's more of it? That wasn't enough of it, and isn't done until it drinks all of it. And that's just the way that's kind of always or became for me. And so I've been sober for a good number of years. I don't drink any alcohol. And I also create kind of like boundaries around that for myself that are like safety boundaries that I've had to learn over time. And different alcoholics, I'm only describing my experience, right? Like everybody's got their own journey around this. I'm not trying to imply that the way I relate to it is the way everybody does or every alcoholic does. But I just do little safety things around myself to kind of create a space to make sure that I don't jump into it again, and that includes things like I just really don't like to go to things that have alcohol as a focus. Bars that are just bars. I'm not going to want to go to a meeting with you if it's just a brewery, but I might feel okay if it's primarily a restaurant that happens to have a brewery. Like, those are examples. And what I've learned a lot of things through it, but one of the biggest things I learned, and one of the biggest things that's kind of kept me healthy and sober, has been that I really like being sober. I learned that I like to have a clear mind. I used to tell myself a lie, or the addiction told me a lie, that I was a better writer or a better thinker when I was drinking. Those are lies. Because I've both written and thought while sober, as well as when I was drunk, and also I didn't click send on stupid things as frequently. Or buy things while drunk. I was really bad about periodically clicking and like ordering another thing on Kickstarter when I was drinking. That was like not a good idea. So that's the whole context. But I want to put this in more of a kind of a reflective context for us, because I think it's so important, because this idea of sobriety comes up in the New Testament a lot. And the idea of sobriety in the New Testament is only kind of related to substances. It is related to substances because people have always been getting drunk, and people have always been using different kinds of other chemicals that influence their brains. But the sobriety that is talked about in the Bible is focused around something a little bit different. And so here's the context for that. I think this is like, this can be really useful tools for us, just in terms of like living in the world that we live in. So the way some, not all, of the New Testament writers wrote about sobriety was they were writing to communities who were having to survive as small, little religious communities whose religion and practice and faith and whatever was pretty radically different than the world around them. These were small, little Christian groups in places like Thessalonica or Rome or other places. Somebody had taken the Christian gospel to those places. Little Christian communities had formed. People are sending letters off to these places, and they're giving them recommendations on how to live. And they frequently, especially the more moderate or slightly conservative letters in the New Testament, tended to write to those places and tell them, among other things, to be sober. And what they tended to mean by this was, you think about this, you know, or you probably have seen non-sober church. Or you've met people who have non-sober faith. Can you think of some examples? People who are super zealous. They're like over the top. Their sense of their religion is that their way of being religious is super superior to yours. They look down on you. They're definitely being saved, and their practices are all the right practices, and their church is the one true and glorious church, and you could kind of keep going on. But then there's the kinds of faith that's not so much about superiority, but it's just more about like, that person's a little weird for practicing their religion in this way. You know, they stand out. Maybe it's how they dress. Maybe it's that they speak in tongues in a church where nobody's speaking in tongues. I'll call one person out in this space. You all try to act Lutheran sober in this space, which means you keep your hands down here the whole time. We have one non-sober person who, as far as I know, doesn't drink on Sunday mornings, and then sometimes Anita joins him, right? And you all see that, and you've all gotten used to Albert, so it's still pretty sober. But if there was a new person that came in and they were out there like that, this would be outside of the range, right? And so there's all kinds of stuff that's outside of the range. And the problem with being outside of the range is, aside from the cultural discomfort of it, if people might look at you or judge you personally, is if your community is outside of the range, then the wider public or political entities notice you. And if your way of practicing religion gets noticed by the state under the Roman Empire, look out. Because the responsibility of the Roman Empire was to maintain the Pax Romana. You got to keep the peace, and the peace is kept with states like Rome through, at the very least, oppression, and at the most, suppression. So, if you start to be noticed and your religion is not the state religion, get ready, because they will send people in because they're worried that there's going to be some kind of disruption, there might be protests, there might be things that the state doesn't like, and so they're going to come in and push it down. So these letters are being sent to these communities saying it's actually a really good survival practice for you to stay sober. I know you love Jesus. I know you feel like you have this huge revelation in your life. Keep it within this range, because otherwise, and you're already going to be, and this is what the letters also say, you're already going to be oppressed, even if you stay within this range, because your faith, the Christian faith that they're writing to them about, is at odds with the principalities and the powers. And some of the letters use the term like the satanic or the demonic forces of the world, just by nature of what they're like. I'll give you one example right now. One of my good friends is a pastor in Chicago, and for the past months, she has been together with other clergy organizing prayer vigils outside of one of the ICE detention centers in Chicago. They're just regularly there. They pray outside. And last week, the federal court there ruled that they can't pray there anymore. Outside. Why? It looks drunk to the state. It looks non-sober. It looks disruptive. It points out to the state that what the state is doing is against the religion of that minority group. And the state has a religion. The state has a religion. And it's not that. The state religion is foreigners are criminal aliens worthy of being sent out because they're not white. That's what the state believes right now. The current administration believes this. And so anything that uses religion to stand up against the state religion looks like has the potential for, especially if they keep showing up. They keep doing it week after week. So that's drunken behavior, like worthy of suppression. You should keep it in your own church, in your own private spaces. You shouldn't be out here like making the ICE detention center look bad. So this is the whole kind of sobriety thing. So sober, in this sense, is much broader than just the use of substances. But what it does do is it draws attention to certain kinds of frames of mind that that the community is being called upon to have in place that are really, I guess you could say, useful for the real proclamation of the gospel. The biggest one, the one that gets wrapped around the sober term the most, has to do with being awake. So a lot of the passages that talk about sobriety also talk about that it's definitely a daytime thing. It's stuff you do in the light. It's not in the darkness. It has to do with awareness and really seeing the world for what it is. It's not numbing. And we have a real tendency to want to numb ourselves to things. In particular, we want to numb ourselves to the stuff that seems intractably dangerous around us that we feel like we can't do much about. It's especially tempting to use tools to become not sober so that you can ignore climate change, rising fascism, or even just more general things like xenophobia or misogyny in the workplace. There's all kinds of these things that we kind of want to, I just can't notice that anymore. So some of the sobriety stuff is about deciding not to be numb and to stay awake. And then it puts that in that framework, this is the way that these texts go, that if you commit to being sober, you should be ready for some level of suffering. For one, because if you see the world as it is and you see those things, you're probably going to continue to keep having the prayer vigil in front of the ICE detention center even after the federal government says it's illegal, because you're going to say, on secular grounds, it's my First Amendment rights to speak in public and pray in public and practice my religion in the public square. And you might go on and point out, for example, that Congress opens every session with prayer, so how can the federal government declare prayer in public illegal when they host prayer every day? You will you will not find it easy to stay sober, is what they're saying. This is true. All you have to do is go talk to people who are addicts in recovery, and many, many people, it's a daily decision to stay sober. Every day is, today I'm going to. The other part of it is, and this is the part that why I decided to add inclusion, part of the awareness around sobriety is we tend not to want to talk about this. We tend to want to just ignore it. And we tend to think that the best adaptive strategy for helping people who are struggling with sobriety is to just add to the options. So as just one example, this is kind of interesting to me. I wrote a thing about this earlier this week, and I kind of tried to explain what it's like. Okay, so like, if you invite me, like let's say you're having a campaign rally for a politician, which almost always has alcohol. That's going to be the kind of event I'm unlikely to go to personally, because I think I'm not that tempted to drink anymore, but I'm definitely more tempted to drink when the drinks are free. I'm always down for free food, free drinks. That's a whole other thing for me. It's like, if you tell me there's free food somewhere, I'm like there, right? So now you're saying the booze are free? That's trouble. And so I don't tend to go. So what the philosophy of people who aren't addicts is, because I just don't think they get it. I think that part of it is they just literally don't understand. Because again, and I live with people who are not addicts, and I know people who are not addicts, so what they think is like, well, why can't you just be by it? You don't have to drink it. There's other things there for you. So they add things, like non-alcoholic options or brew coffee for the, and this is a lot like other things. You can start expanding this out into other things. The same stuff happens with people who are vegetarians or people who don't eat sugar, or we tend to just kind of want to add options. And so one of the examples of how I've processed this differently over time in the church space is to ask myself, is that how you want to do it for the most religious or sacred aspects of our practice together? Is that accessible? And I remember a number of years ago, this is when I first started thinking about this, a number of years ago I went to a synod event, like when a bunch of churches all get together and send representatives, and so then they had worship and they had communion. And this was right around the time when, in addition to recognizing there needed to be juice for the alcoholics, they had also it had become more popular to make this non-alcoholic wine, which some people like better than the juice. Some people, it kind of just depends on what your needs are. And so somebody had come up with this bright idea to make a chalice that had little dividers in it. So it was a big cup, and it had one section in there that was juice, and then one section that was, you can see where this is going, can't you? One that was non-alcoholic wine and one that was wine. And it was working just fine. They had instructed everybody to take communion by dipping the wafer in their chosen beverage. Except for we had hosts, we were hosting guests from Ethiopia. There's a lot of Lutherans in Ethiopia. There's actually multiple times more Lutherans in Ethiopia than in the United States, like millions and millions. And we were hosting some bishops from Ethiopia. And they either didn't hear the instructions or didn't understand it as it was spoken. And the most common practice around the world for how you have communion is a common or shared cup. So the first person goes up, gets their wafer, pops it in their mouth, does the sign of the cross, goes to the chalice, takes the chalice, and goes to drink it, right? And I saw this, and I was like, why do we have three different things, But for a long time, we just kept doing this. And then it occurred to me one time that, as far as I know, almost nobody has an issue with gluten-free bread. There might be some exceptions, so this whole logic can fall apart on some things because there's always maybe going to be somebody who has texture issues or something, but at least as accessible as possible, gluten-free bread is pretty solid. Sometimes too solid. And then most people can drink juice, so we just went to just the gluten-free bread and just the juice. So you don't have to decide. Now, I don't know whether that's the best solution or not, but what I do know is it does not put the pressure on the person receiving to make a decision or find their solution to whatever it is that might otherwise divide them from the table. It put the pressure on us to have decided in advance. Sobriety is doing that work before you get to the table. That's what sobriety is. You ask yourself, what do I need to have done before I get there so that I can see with clarity how I'm supposed to show up and what it's going to be like for others to show up. Sobriety, especially if you're, in a sense, I don't know if this is the right way to say this, but it does feel this way to me. I feel like I was forced to become sober. I got so addicted to it and abused it that the only choice I had was I got to stop. And then I live with that decision now for the rest of my life of not of drinking those things. But having gone through that, I have this awareness or sympathy with people who have also gone through it that's different from people who haven't gone through it and for whom their brains don't work that way. So I'm at least alert to that. Does that mean I'm alert to everything? Absolutely not. I know I have blind spots. So sobriety is like an ongoing work. But the inclusion part is you take that work that's been done and you live in solidarity with the people who otherwise they would have to do work to get to your table that you could have done before they got there. You go back to this example of the clergy who are out there praying for those in ICE detention and those being picked up and being put into ICE detention. That's also a pre-kind of work. I am 100% confident that I am never going to get stopped in Washington County because of racial profiling. I drive a pickup, and I am white. Cops don't even stop me at all when I'm doing something bad because I have so much privilege. They can't see into my truck because I'm up high and I'm white. I remember, actually, before I had the truck, I drove a little electric car, a Leaf. That was when I got stopped. They could see down into my car, so if I didn't have my seatbelt on or something like that, then they would be able to look. So if you're going to have any kind of sense of what it's like for immigrants right now, you have to actually get into that space enough and solidarity with that space enough to actually be sober. The clergy who are out in front of the ICE detention center right now praying were already practicing sobriety. What they will have to ask themselves now, are they sober enough to stay? Here's the really wild part. It would be drunken to not stay. Not staying after the federal government says to you, you can't pray there, is actually drunkenness. You're comforting yourself. You're appeasing yourself. You're numbing it. You're like, I can't do that. So the concept in Scripture around sobriety is, whether it's in Timothy or Thessalonians or Romans, is that when you live in that sober way, you are to be prepared for the point at which you're actually going to have to go up against the powers, as it were. I have a friend who posted this yesterday, and I think it's 100% right. There's this kind of idea, okay? If you just have a general disagreement with people about something in your religion, you can just let it go. You know, like whether you prefer the organ or the band. These are not fighting categories within religious faith. Either one is fine. You can have your preferences, and that's fine too. You could totally like the organ and hate the guitar. That's also fine. But then there's other things where if that thing comes up within religion and somebody says, no, you can't do that, not only is it not fine, but you actually have a responsibility to do that because they've told you it's not fine. This in Lutheran tradition is called the state of confession. So a state of confession is when, because of the situation and what's being defined around you, you have to do it. You have to obey God rather than men. Now, this is the tricky part. You can trick yourself into entering into a state of confession and doing something radical and doing it for the wrong reason because you want to get attention, or because you you haven't thought through it enough, or because you're just a jerk. Some of us who are more like that in terms of our personality are going to be like, heck yeah, finally I can get everybody to join me in my state of confession. I've always wanted to do a state of confession. So you have to be really careful about it. This is why there's actually a whole entry in the Lutheran Confessions around state of confession. But an actual state of confession, if it's really there, then if it's a state of confession, then you stand there. When you stand there, that's the most sober thing you can do. And everyone and everything tacking against you will perceive you as drunk. Not sober. Crazy. Heretic. Disruptor of the state. Hater of billionaires. Antifa. So the parts in here, and I'm just going to stop because there's just a lot of interesting stuff to continue to reflect on around this, but living the gospel in that space, I think, has a couple of components that are worth kind of just sitting with in an ongoing way and reflecting what it means. One has to do with what I essentially kind of talked about as solidarity with people for whom various kinds of vulnerabilities mean that if you can figure out how to have the table set for them in the right way, take that responsibility to do it. That's one part. That's the solidarity piece. Can you figure out better how to not be ableist? Can you figure out better how to welcome people who are neurodivergent? Can you figure out better how to make sure the table is accessible to the majority of the people who have come into the space without making them do the work of figuring out how to get to the table? That's all one piece. And then the other part about sobriety and inclusion is, will you stand? Has your sobriety prepared you to stay firm? And I don't really want to have to emphasize that point, but we're there. Multiple ways. And so you'll need other people. It's a lot easier to stand if you have others. And you have God. And you have Christ. Amen.